How do I talk to MySQL from C#? That's a pretty common question. MySQL databases are very popular, especially on the web. So when you're building a web application especially, you might be considering using MySQL. Fortunately, there's a very easy way to connect to MySQL databases using C#, and in this video, I'm going to show you how to do just that. Now, in case you haven't watched my videos before, my name is Tim Corey, and it's my goal to make learning C# easier. My goal isn't to entertain you. My goal is to turn you into a world-class developer. I do that by making sure that everything I teach focuses on preparing you for the real world. If you want to get ready for real-world development, whether you're just starting out or have already been doing it for a while, hit the subscribe button to make sure you don't miss a thing. Okay, let's go to Visual Studio, and we're going to create a new project. Now, since MySQL typically deals with web applications, it doesn't have to. You can do desktop applications for sure. But since it's typically a web application thing, let's build a web application. Now, if I'm going to use a web application, I'm going to default to Blazor server. I'm going to choose a Blazor app here. And the reason why is because if I don't know going in what the application is going to be like, or if it's a demo application, or if it's a pretty broad range of reasons, I typically use Blazor server. It's the best kind of overall or well-rounded thing to use in my opinion. So I'm going to use a Blazor server project. So let's call this, let's call it Blazor server for the project name, and the solution name will be connecting to MySQL. All right, so Blazor server application will configure for HTTPS, but not for Docker support. And hit create. So now we have an application that's got just the basics of Blazor. So if we run this, let's just give a quick run here and see what it looks like to make sure we understand what the starting point is. All right, let's drag it onto the screen. There you go. So there's our Blazor server application. So we got the counter. We can click that. We can fetch data. If we go back and fetch data again, notice this number is 43 right now, and now it's 42, and now it's 22. So it changes every time we go to that page. So that's just the basics of Blazor server and what it looks like right out of the box. Now that we have this, let's start talking about how to add MySQL. Now what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to show you how to set it up in a class library. And one of the reasons why I'm going to do that is because you can take this same class library and use it in a different video or a different application. How about that? If you're doing videos, you can do it using videos too. But in a ASP.NET Core MVC application, or ASP.NET Core Razor Pages, or API, or WPF, or WinForms, or even Console. So you can use the same library, the same code, to do data access in any of those. It's not a Blazor server specific bit of code. So if you're thinking about asking the question, but Tim, how do you do this in, and name a different user interface, I'm going to tell you this answer, the same way. Okay? So we're going to do it intentionally separate from the user interface. You should definitely do this when you're building applications. Create it separate from your user interface. So let's right click on a solution. We're going to add a new project, and we're going to choose a class library. Okay, so we can just type in here, class library, and we get a few choices. We get .NET Standard, we get Universal Windows, we get Razor Class Library, .NET Framework, and .NET Core. Now, we're doing a .NET Core project, but we could also do .NET Standard. The difference is we can use this project in other platforms as well. So notice Android, iOS, Linux, Mac, Windows. So it's pretty much a universal platform at .NET Standard. I'm going to choose .NET Standard because if I choose a .NET Standard 2.0 project, not 2.1, which is the latest version that's out right now, but 2.0. If I choose 2.0, then this library will work also on .NET Framework as well as Xamarin. So you can use the same the same library across pretty much any project type. The one exception being Blazor WebAssembly, because Blazor WebAssembly cannot talk directly to a database. So, our class library .NET Standard. That's why I'm choosing this one. We hit next, and we'll say this is our data libraries. Fine. And this is going to create our application for us. Notice if we go to data library here, it says .NET Standard 2.0. That's what we want. We don't want 2.1 here. Let's delete class 1. I always like to delete those classes instead of trying to rename it and potentially having a problem. So let's start by adding references. So right-click on Dependencies and say Manage NuGet Packages. And we're going to install, first of all, Dapper. This is my go-to library for accessing data. It's really lightweight, and it accesses a number of different databases. So notice SQL Server, MySQL, SQLite, SQL CE, Firebird, etc. There's a lot in that etc. So this one library, the same code base, can be used over and over and over again to access different data types or database types. Let's install that. And we're also going to install one more thing, and that is MySQL.data. And what this does is it allows us to access and talk to a MySQL database. Okay, so notice it's .NET Framework, .NET Standard, if it's 2.0, .NET Standard if it's 2.1. So this will install on a number of different platforms. So we want the .NET Standard version, which is going to install for us. So MySQL.data, hit install, and that will say I accept. And now we are going to have access to our MySQL database. Now let's write all the code we need to talk to MySQL. So let's right-click on Data Library. We're going to say Add New Class. And the class name, let's call this Data Access. If we're going to have data access for more than one type of database, that would specify MySQL Data Access. But in this case, I think we can get away with saying just Data Access. Make this class public. And inside here, I am going to add two methods. All right. And so we're going to talk through these as we go, but I understand if they don't totally click the first time. That's okay. We're going to come back and review them again at the end after we've used them. So you kind of see what's going on, but I'll talk you through as we go. Now, if you've watched my other Dapper videos, a lot of this is going to look very, very similar because it really is the same or almost the same. It's not the same, but it's almost the same. So let's look at this. Using IDB connection. So using an IDB connection, which it messed my curly braces up a little bit, that's okay. Oh, you know why? Because I'm not inside a class or inside a method. We got talking, didn't actually finish my train of thought. Let's start with the method name. Public static list of T. Okay, that's what's going to return. Load data. And I like to pass in two generics. All right, string, SQL, and then U parameters. And then finally string connection string. Okay, that's the information that's our signature for our method. So this is the load data method. It's going to go to a table and get information out of it. All right, so it's a generic method. So it's got T and U, which I just named those based upon whatever I felt like. Now, typically your first generic letter is T. That's the standard. And so the next letter in the alphabet is U. Therefore, I chose U. So what we got here is we're passing in, we'll get back to what these are in just a minute. First of all, we have passed in the SQL statement. This is the statement that says select star from this table or insert into, well, it didn't say insert, this is a load, but it would say select from table. Okay, that's the SQL statement. Then we have, and no, it's not a MySQL statement. Even though this is a MySQL database, the actual syntax is called SQL. Okay, so it's SQL syntax. Therefore, we just call it SQL. That's fine. U parameters. So this is our first generic in use. What does that U stand for? It stands for any type. We're saying any type we're going to send as parameters. That means I can send a dictionary, I can send an anonymous class, I can send a whole bunch of other things through this, and it will pop through as parameters. For most cases, that makes things really easy. So we're going to leave it like this. And then finally, we have our connection string. This is how we connect to our database. Now inside here, let's put our using statement. So I'm going to paste that back in. So IDB connection, let's call this connection. And we'll say equals new MySQL connection. Okay. Now notice it actually added a using statement up here. So it actually added this one too when I did the IDB connection. This is the smart upgrades to our editor here. I didn't have it as a using statement, but it says, oh, you know what? I know you need that one. So therefore, let's just add it instead of asking you or making you even doing a control dot to add it. So new MySQL connection, and we're going to pass in the connection string. So what this does is it opens a connection to my MySQL database using the connection string that you passed in. And it does it in a using statement so that when we're done, it's going to close this connection properly, no matter what. Even if you crash the application, it's going to try to close it properly. Now, there's a weird edge case you could probably hit where it wouldn't close connection properly, but as much as you can control, it's going to close that connection properly. Now, inside here, we're going to say list of T rows equals connection.query. Notice I added the using Dapper at the top. That's pretty awesome stuff here. And of type T. So there's our other generic. So we're saying query of type T, meaning, hey, I want you to run this query. So run this, let's just say select star from, in our case, it's going to be the people table. So select star from people. Well, each row that comes back, I want you to put it into this particular model type. And that model type is going to be the T. So in our case, we'll create a model that has first name and last name. We'll call it the person model. Well, we're going to pass the person model in as this T, and it's going to say, okay, I'm going to map the data coming out into, for each row, it'll be a of type T, which is person model in our case. Well, it'll be a set of those, one per row. All right, so that's what's going to happen. And we're going to say, there's the SQL to call. And then we also have to pass in our parameters. And finally, we're going to say to list. And add the system using system.link at the top as well. So what this has done is it's made a call to our connection. That's our connection to MySQL. And it said, hey, here's a SQL to run. And by the way, there's probably some parameters to insert into that statement. Therefore, there's the parameters as well. This protects us against the SQL injection because we're not actually adding the two together as a string. We're allowing MySQL, or we're allowing this program to do it in a more safe manner. You should still protect the data coming in as your parameters, but this is one more layer of protection. So we take our SQL statement, we stick in our parameters, we call that, and then the records that get returned, each row goes into that type. We get a set of those types. It's actually an IEnumerable of that type. And then we're going to convert it to list, because I like list because unlike with like maybe an entity framework, we've already preloaded the data. It's not like the data isn't already here. So therefore, I want it to be in a list so I have more options of how to work with that data. So we're going to do that right away. And then down below, I'm going to say return rows. Now I do just have this in two lines. So I have a line here and a line here. I could eliminate this right here and just put a return statement where that code is highlighted. And I can eliminate this other line down here. Well, I could. But what's going to happen is it's going to be a little harder to debug Therefore, I'm going to put in 2 lines, and then I can put a breakpoint right here, see what my rows are before I return them, and just make sure everything is good. That's just a nice way of doing debugging that helps you now when you're first trying it out, but it also helps you down the road. So I prefer to do 2 lines here instead of a 1-liner. Yes, you could break it into 2 lines later on, but in doing so, you're changing code while trying to debug it. And if you change code while you're trying to debug it, you may change what's happening, and it might affect the debugging process. You might actually run up the wrong tree trying to find something because you actually introduced a bug when you changed out the 1-liner for 2 lines. So I would just say leave it like this. Okay, so that's our load data. Now you're probably thinking, how do we save data? Well, that's the next method. In fact, that method's pretty close, so I'm going to copy this entire statement and paste it down below. We're going to call this save data. And instead of, it should not be, let's make them static. Let's leave them static. I've been back and forth debating this. You can instantiate this if you want. Well, it's a debate. I'm going to instantiate it. And here's why. I'm going to put it through dependency injection, which means I can also then, in my unit testing, replace this piece of it with a mocked version of it so that I don't actually write to my database when I'm doing unit tests, which is important. So I'm going to take it off static. So save data is going to be a void instead of list of t. And it's going to be we're just going to pass t in, not t and u. We're not going to have a return statement. We're not going to have, this will be t parameters, not u parameters. And then down here, instead of query with a type t, we're going to have execute. And of course, you don't send it to list because there's nothing being returned. And we're also not going to be doing that. So now it's just connection.execute. So this is really just a stripped down version of this that takes out all the return stuff and just changes query to execute instead. So now we are sending in our SQL string like before. We're setting our parameters like before, but we're calling it t instead of u because it's the first generic value. If you want to be consistent, you could switch these around and make this u and then make this t. That way it's the same between the 2 methods if you need to do that. I haven't bothered. The connection string like before, we're still connecting to the MySQL database. This time we're just saying execute, and there's our SQL and our parameters. That's all we need to do. Okay, so that's our save data method. And that's all there is to probably about 95% of your data access with MySQL. So let's actually use this to see how it works. Let's go back to our Blazor project. Let's leave it open for now. We can go back to our Blazor project here, and first thing we need to do is add a dependency. So add our dependency to a project reference, and that's our data library. Note that you don't add a dependency the other direction. You do not add a dependency in data library to your Blazor server project. That would create a circular dependency, and you can't do that because one of the projects has to get compiled first before it can be used in the other project when it gets compiled. So if they both depend on each other, then neither one can compile because they're always waiting for the other one to be compiled first. So that's why we can't have a circular dependency. So now in our pages, let's go to let's create a new page. We'll create a new Razor component. And a Razor component is a Blazor page. I know it sounds confusing that it's a Razor component and it's a Blazor page because a Razor page is something different. Yes, that's confusing. But a Razor component is either a piece of a page or a whole page, depending on how you configure it. And that's a Blazor server or Blazor WebAssembly thing. So we're going to create a Razor component. We're going to call this our just people. Sounds good to me. Now, when you're first starting out creating Razor components, it can be somewhat intimidating to say, what do I add now to this page? But don't worry, you can go to the Fetch Data page and kind of see how this flow goes. For example, we have these three things up top. We have the @page reference, which says here's basically the URL for this page. That's the path to get to it. So it's /fetch-data. Then we have a using statement and how to do that. And we have an inject statement. This is a dependency injection. So we'll use all three of these eventually. But first, this inject, well, you have to have something in dependency injection in order to inject it. So let's do that. Let's go to our startup.cs. And about a third of the way down here, we have configure services. Well, we can say services.add. And here we have our choice of singleton or transient or scoped. In this case, I'm going to add a singleton for our data access. Notice that I don't have a using yet, but when I fill this in, it's going to create a using for me. Now, I could create an interface for this, but I don't think it's necessary for this demo project because you can still replace this with a different one if you really want to. You know what? Nope, I'm going to do it the whole way. That way, I prefer to have an interface because then it's easier for your unit testing to replace it, and because that way you're set up for the future. So let's just do that real quick because it's important to do things right. I prefer to do that so that you can see the real world interactions, not just, hey, this is a demo, don't do it this way in the real world. I try to avoid that as much as possible. So on our public class data access, I've got my cursor there. Okay, control dot, I'm going to say extract interface. I'm going to create that interface. Notice that it's going to say, hey, which public members do you want to add to this interface? By default, it's all of them. And the new file name is going to be I, and then the name of your class, which is perfect. So now we have an interface that matches our class. And some people ask the question, well, why would you do that? That seems like a waste. Well, but it's not. And the reason why is because now in our dependency injection, we can come over here and say data access, and the implementation is data access. And what that allows us to do is we'll ask for data access. Well, it doesn't have to be the data access class we give it. That's just the one we put into this current dependency injection system. But for unit testing, we can put a different class in. And down the road, if we say, you know what, that data access class is kind of messed up, but we can't really touch it in all the areas. Well, we can replace it or create a new version of it that is that's called better data access that also implements data access. And then we can inject that in this one spot and change our entire application. So there's some real benefits here to doing it this way. And again, I'm trying to do it the way that you're actually going to see it in the real world. So now we have our singleton added, which means that we're going to create the instance once for our entire web server. So multiple people will use the same instance, which is fine because we're not storing any data. So instead of creating it and destroying it over and over again, we're going to create it once and not destroy it until we're done with our web server, until our web server reboots. Which that does use memory constantly for this. It's not something I do for all of my classes, but it is such a fundamental class, the data access, that I think we're going to use it enough to justify the added overhead of always having it in memory versus creating it and destroying it multiple times. So it's not just a given that we're going to make it a singleton, but that's what I'm going to choose to do for this one. So now if we go back to fetch data, let's just copy all three of these lines. So we have a model for our people class. I'm going to come down here and I'll paste them. And we're not going to call this fetch data, we're going to call it people. And we don't need a using for Blazor server.data, but we do need one for data library dot, actually nothing, just data library. Now you could add this using to our imports.razor, but since we'll only use it on this page, I'm not going to do that. And finally, we're going to say inject, I'm going to say IDataAccess, and we'll call this data. All right. So now we can say, and actually I'm going to say underscore data. That way we know that it's a kind of a don't mess with me field. That's kind of what I think of when I see the underscore first. It's either a private backing field or it is a value that's been injected with our dependency injection system. So now we have access to our data, but how do you make this call? Again, fetch data will help us out. If we come down here, you'll see that we do the protected override async task on initialized async. Well, this is where the call is made to the service, and it's awaitable. So we want to do something similar here because we want to talk to our database. Well, one thing we need to do, we should make this asynchronous. Right now, our data access isn't asynchronous. Now, on the web, even though you're making synchronous calls, it's really asynchronous because of how the web works. But we still want to make our calls asynchronous whenever possible. So let's transition this over to an asynchronous database connection. Let's start with save data first. This is a pretty easy one. If we do a Control-J here, it's going to give us a list, and one of the options is execute async. There we go. Now notice that that's going to return a task. So we want to return that and make this a task. Okay, so we're not, whoops, Control-J here, or Control-Dot here to add the using statement. So now we're not awaiting this. We can say await, and then we can go back to avoid, but that's not what we want to do. We want to return the actual task because there's no reason to await it here. We're just saying, hey, go ahead and execute this. The caller can wait on it. We don't need to wait on it. So that takes care of save data. Now notice that IDataAccess is now yelling at us because our signature has changed. But we can do Control-Dot and say that we want to pull that up into IDataAccess. All right, so now it's in IDataAccess. The only problem is, and I think I might have changed that command, it pulled it up, but it added it instead of updating it. There we go. So not ideal the way we did that, but it did work. Okay, let's look at load data. Well, first of all, we know we want to return we want to have an asynchronous here. So we want to say query async, so Control-J and say query async, but then it's going to yell us for the to list. And the reason why is because query async doesn't return a IEnumerable anymore. It returns a task of type IEnumerable. Therefore, we can't do to list. So let's take that off and let's say that we want to await this. Like so, which means you have to say that this is a sync, and this is going to be a task of type list of t that we return. There we go. So we're awaiting this, but it's saying, hey, you can't implicitly convert from IEnumerable to a list of t. We got to change this. Well, we can do a shortcut and say var, which would change it to IEnumerable of type t. Of course, then we can't return that. We've got to say .toList. So now we've kind of solved this, but let's look at how we solved it and why we did it this way. Down here, we didn't do an await, but up here, we're doing an await. Why? Well, because up here, we really wanted to return a list, not an IEnumerable. Well, to do that, we have to await or wait for this to be done before we then convert the results to a list. Therefore, we have to do an await. So we not only return a task of type list of t, but we also mark the method as async. Notice that this method down here is not marked as async. And the reason why is there's no await in here. There's no reason to mark it as async. So let's go back to our method here. We're going to do a control dot to change the signature. Nope. Let's try it again. I was trying to find out if we can see a different way to pull that up. So let's pull it up, and we're going to pull it up to IDataAccess. It is going to create a duplicate, but fortunately, if you hit F12 on your IDataAccess, you can go right to it, and you can eliminate the one that's incorrect. So if you're renaming it or changing that signature line, it makes it a little bit more messy, but it's not that hard to redo. So now we have everything asynchronous in our data access class. Now we can follow the same pattern that they have here. So let's just copy this. I'm going to copy it and comment it out. So down here in our code, I'm going to paste it. I'm going to comment this out. This allows me to see what it is, but at the same time, not use it. I'm going to say protected override. And I say on initialized async, which messes with the formatting. This is a known Blazor issue. So let's just reformat that manually for a minute. So on initialized async, I've got to mark this as, or uninitialize async, but we have to mark it here as async. We want to make an async call. We don't need this return base. So now what we can do is we can say await and then make a call to our underscore data dot load data. Okay, that's what we're going to do in just a minute. But first, we have to have a model to put the data into, and we have to have something to call, and then we have to create a private variable up here somewhere to actually put it into. That's a lot of stuff to do, kind of. I'm going to open up my MySQL database. Now, I haven't shown you how to install MySQL. That's kind of outside the scope of this video, especially since it's going to be a little bit long anyway. But this is MySQL installed on my machine. This is MySQL Workbench. I've got a database here called YTDemo with one table in it called people. And if we do a select star from people, it's really small, so let's zoom in here. This is the results you get. So there's the 6 records. So we have Tim Corey, Jane Smith, Sue Storm, Bob McClure, Mary Jones, and Ray Stone. Those are the 6 records we have in our database right now. Note that the 3 columns are ID, first name, and last name. So over here, let's go to let's right click on our Blazor server and say add new folder and call it models. And then in here, we're going to create a new model. And we're going to call this, we can really put this in our data access library, but I think it's okay in the user interface as well. So let's call this the person model. And we're going to create 3 properties. Prop, tab twice, int ID, enter twice, prop, tab twice, string, tab, first name, hit enter, enter again. It's a really quick way to create these things. All right, so there's 3 auto properties in our POCO object, our plain old CLR object. So that's a person model. So now we can do is up here, we can say that we want a list of person model. And it says, hey, that's actually in this path right here. Let's add a using statement for that. So add a using for Blazor server.models. And now you can get rid of this portion. Makes it a little less verbose. We'll call this people. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to initialize it as, actually I'm not going to initialize it. I'm going to leave it null. So the reason why is because we're going to do a check on this to see if there's any people in the list yet. So if you notice in the Razor pages up here at the beginning, if forecast equals null, then say, hey, we're loading. And the reason for that is because we load this page and then we load the data. So the page will actually show first and then the data will get populated. Depending on how long it takes to populate the data, will determine how long we see that loading screen for. The uninitialized async, the reason why we execute it that way is because we want to make sure that we are injecting our stuff first and that everything is here. So we say, okay, let everybody come in. Let's load this piece, load that piece, bring all of our dependency injection stuff in. Let's make sure the page is rendered. And then once that's all in, okay, now let's use that stuff to then load our data and put it on the page. So that's why we have the uninitialized async instead of a constructor to do this call. So now we can uncomment this. We can say people, if I can spell it right, people equals await data.load data. Well, I need a SQL statement and parameters and a connection string. Okay, let's get those. So let's start with a SQL statement. String SQL equals, let's start really simple. Select star from people. All right, that's the name of the table. So that's our entire SQL statement. So we can say, first of all, there's our SQL statement. Now for our parameters, we don't have any, so let's return a new anonymous object. And then finally, we need a connection string. Let's just put an empty connection string for now. We don't have that yet. Oh, and that's yelling at us because we didn't actually specify what T and U were. So we're going to say the T is our model, so person model, and then U is dynamic. There we go. So now we have our call. We still need a connection string though. So let's go up to inject up here. We're going to inject one more thing, and that's going to be our I configuration. And we'll call it config. And that's going to add this whole using statement here. Let's cut this out and add it as a using. Like so. So now we've injected our I configuration, which can talk to our appsettings.json file. So now down here, we can say _config.getConnectionString, and let's call this just our default connection. All right, so it's going to get our connection string, the default one, and it's going to load it in here. But we do need to add a connection string called default in order to call it. So let's go over to our appsettings.json again. After allowed host, we're going to say comma. We're going to say connection strings, plural, inside quotes, and then a colon, and then a curly brace, open and closed, and default, that's the name of our connection string, and then here is the actual connection string. Now you can go to connectionstrings.com, I believe, and find out a MySQL connection string that works for you, but I'm going to type one out that I know works. Server equals, in this case it's installed locally, so that is my local host port or server number. That's everyone's local host IP address. And then we have the port number. My port number is 3306. Database, we're going to say that the database is called YTDemo. This is the database I created. And then we have a username. So user ID with a space in it equals YTUser. So I'm giving you my username right now. You can see that. And then here it gets even scarier. Password equals, this is a super secret one. If you know that password, you can not only crack into this application, but also you can crack into TIMCO Retail Manager if you're on my machine. So it's definitely not safe. It's doubly not safe because we're using it for both locations. But yes, this is a username and password in your appsettings.json file. Now, if you watched my video, the dev questions video on securing a connection string, that applies here. So if you haven't watched that, go check that out to see why this isn't a problem. Because this is going to get installed on a web server, it's okay to have it in clear text. Now, beyond that, we're probably also going to have this be our developer connection string. And then when we deploy to production, the deployment process will replace this connection string with the connection string for production. So this should be a password that anyone can know, and it's okay. And I'm showing it on camera. I'm not blurring it out because you can know that my developer system, the password for my developer demo database is pwd12345, period. Okay, so just note that's okay to do. Don't get freaked out there. Don't ignore it. Don't just pretend like the world is good, even though you got a password in clear text. There's things to think through. Again, watch that dev questions video on securing a connection string. Okay, so there's a connection string. It's called default. So now when we ask for default, it's going to give us that connection string in its place. So now we have this people list. In theory, it's going to get populated from our database. So let's show that off. So up here in the HTML section, I'm going to say if people equals null. Okay, we're going to start off with an if statement, just like we did over here. Because if it's null, we haven't yet loaded our data. So I'm going to grab the same loading screen or loading stuff just so that it's consistent. And we'll say else. So if it's not null, there's something in it. If there's something in it, let's go ahead and display that. Now, normally I'd create a table here and make it, striped and a dark header and all the fun stuff. But for this video, I'm just going to do a simple for each. And we're going to loop through every P in people. And we're going to do something really simple. We're going to say a paragraph tag. And inside there, we're going to say at p dot first name space at p dot last name. That's it. So a paragraph for each person's name is just going to list them on our screen. Really not pretty, but it at least shows us that it's working. Okay, so let's run this application as it is right now, loading data from the MySQL database. Okay, we can come over here and nothing seems to have changed. But if we go to our path, which is /people, so /people, there's our people. Okay, that's loaded the people from a database. There's a bigger view for you. So that's loaded the people from our database from MySQL. It was fast enough that it didn't even really show that loading screen. But that's how you call MySQL from your C# code, whether it's Blazor server or it's ASP.NET Core MVC or ASP.NET MVC, the .NET framework version, or WPF or WinForms or whatever else you really want except for the Blazor WebAssembly version. So that wasn't that hard once we got set up, right? Once we configured data access, which this code doesn't really change. So once I configure that, then it really comes down to just making these one-liner calls. And you'll probably ask the question, well, Tim, what about actually inserting data or updating data or deleting data? How do we do those things? Well, I'm glad you asked because we're going to do all of those things. So let's start off by putting some buttons up here. And I'm going to go over to my counter page. This is why these pages are here. Okay, so you may wonder, well, why is there these sample pages in my brand new project? I want to be clean. Well, yes, but you're also probably learning Blazor server, and this is a great way to have quick samples. When you're done with it, just delete these 2 pages, and then delete the data folder too. But that's it. Delete those things, and it's all gone. So in this instance, I have a button here. We click on the counter page that does something. Well, I'm going to copy that button. So I have my example, and then up here, I'm going to paste that button in, And I'm going to say, instead of click me, I'm going to say insert. And we'll call this onClick insert data. And then let's come down here to our code, and we're going to say private async task insert data, like so. So it's going to be an asynchronous method that's going to do an insert when we click that button. Well, what are we going to do? Well, let's create a string SQL equals, and let's say insert into, insert into people, first name, last name, values at first name, at last name. Okay? So that's a very simple insert statement for a MySQL database. We're going to insert a record, one record, into our, semicolon. We're going to insert one record into our people table. We're going to insert just two columns, the first name and the last name. The ID column is auto-incrementing, so we'll leave it alone. And the values we're going to insert are parameters that are first name parameter and last name parameter. So that's our SQL statement. Now let's create our call. So we're going to say await. You want to await until it's done, but data.save data. Remember, data is our connection to MySQL. Save data, and we're going to start off with our SQL statement, and then we're going to say new, and then our dynamic parameter is going to be, say, first name equals, I'm going to hard code this to Billy, and last name equals Bob. Okay, so that's our parameters, and then finally let's bring in our default connection string. So comma and our default connection string. So now we have our call. Yes, we're going to hard code this data. I'm not going to create an insert form on this page. I just want to show you how an insert would work. If you create an insert form, you just take the values from that form and put them in these spots. So let's do an insert into our database. Let's first go to our database. So let's bring it over here. I'm going to run this statement again, just so you can see there are 6 records. Okay, and let's zoom in here and notice we see record 6 is Ray Stone. That's the last one. There is no Billy Bob in this list. So let's run this again. And we're going to, once it runs, we're going to click the button that just says insert. So we'll go to /people. There's an insert button. I did it. It seems like nothing happened, but watch if you go off this page and then go back to people. Now Billy Bob's in the list. Now why didn't it refresh? Because we didn't actually refresh the data. We could have. Let's go back over here, execute this again. Notice that number 7 right down here is Billy Bob. So we have done insert now in that one line of code. Now, if I'd wanted to refresh the data, I could have done one of two things. I could have either just put a new entry in people for Billy Bob, or what I could have done is I could have called this method again. And that would have reloaded the page by putting the people, updating the people list with new data. In fact, I'll probably do that for the next one. So the next one, I'm going to create a private async task that's going to be update data. Again, we're not taking information in. We're just going to hard code this thing. String SQL equals update people set first name equals Timothy, where last name equals, single quotes, Corey. There we go. So there's our update statement. We're going to update the people table. We're going to set the first name column to be Timothy, where the last name column equals Corey. Make sure you have the where clause on any update statement or delete statements, because otherwise you affect all the rows in your table, not just one. Pretty common mistake, especially for newer database developers, although we all do it. So now I'm going to copy this entire statement like so. And actually, I could have done a parameter here just to show that how a parameter would work. Let's do that. So at last name and at first name. So the first name is going to be Timothy. That's the new name to put in place. And the last name is going to be Corey. That's the name to match on. But it's still the same save data, and we're still using the same connection string. So the only thing we'll do at the end here, let's say, go to the next line, and down here we're going to say that you want to call the on-initialized async, like so, and we'll await that. All right, so we're gonna make this call again. Even though it's called onInitialize async, we can call it again from another method to kind of refresh that data. So right now the data says Tim. Let's zoom in here. It says Tim Corey, not Timothy Corey. Let's create a button for this. So let's copy this button. Let's paste it. We're going to say that this is update data. And we'll say update. And you know what? We're going to change this to warning, just to have a different color, because why not? All right, so we're launching this. Once it launches, we'll go to the /people page. And now we have an insert and an update. Let's hit update. Watch Tim here. It now says Timothy Corey, because it's updated and it called the refresh to the database. If we execute this again, we'll see that yes, in fact, our database does say Timothy. We have done an update. Of course, you've already seen that because you saw the results load in, but I want to make sure you know there's nothing up my sleeve. Okay, let's do one more. So we're going to copy the button here, and we're going to say delete data, and we'll say delete, not delete. There we go. And this is going to be danger. Again, just to change the color of the button. So let's copy the update statement, the whole thing, and we'll say delete data. There we go. And we're going to delete from people where last name equals last name. So now we're only passing one parameter in. So let's take off the first name here. And instead, we're going to change this. Yeah, let's just delete me. That's fine. No, you know what? I'm going to delete Bob. So last name is Bob. So Billy Bob is going to get deleted. All right. So we're also going to still await that and on-initialize async. The only difference is our SQL command and which parameters we're sending in. So let's run this again and see if the delete command works. I may have a setting in my MySQL database that doesn't allow you to delete this way. We're going to find out. Delete. It went away. Cool. So it did delete. I don't have that setting, which is great for demo purposes. Notice that Billy Bob is in fact gone. The last record here is Ray Stone. Now the cool thing is we can now say, actually let's fix insert. So we actually have that right there, the update, like so. So that now when we do an insert, we'll see it appear in the list. That way we can see all of these happen right away. So /people. We can say insert, and now Billy Bob is there. We can say delete, and Billy Bob goes away. We can say update, and nothing really happens or appears to because Timothy is still Timothy. Okay, so that's how you do all 4 of the CRUD actions with MySQL. We have our create, which is our insert. We have our our read, which is our load data. We have our update, which is our update. We have our delete, which of course is our delete. So that's 4 CRUD actions. So with these examples, you can do a lot of stuff with MySQL and C#. The two work together really well. Okay, so hopefully that was instructive and helpful to get you started using MySQL in C# easily. If you have any questions or want to see some more advanced stuff in this, or just want to see something else, maybe a different database, let me know in the comments down below. I'd be happy to put it on the suggestion list and hopefully create a video for that topic. Okay, thanks for watching, and as always, I am Tim Corey.